If you've been under a rock, you don't know that the digital advertising industry right now is dealing with a pretty significant fraud problem. And so to discuss where the industry is at in combating it and what more might be done, we're going to have two really experienced panelists. We're going to have John Murphy from OpenX. He runs marketplace quality there. And then Ted McConnell, who spent 30 years at P&G and is now in ad tech consulting. So why don't you guys come join me on the stage? Let's get a round of applause for John and Ted.
Walk in the door, I know you're coming down. Everyone's around. It's coming to life.
So I was at the IAB's annual leadership meeting in February, and the big conversation there was about ad fraud, supply chain. It was actually pretty amazing how much time was dedicated to basically rally cries that the industry needs to fix this problem. You know, the chairman of the IAB said it was a crisis. So it's one thing to talk the talk, it's another thing to walk the walk. And we're lucky because we have John here, who is working on marketplace quality for OpenX, which sees the second most amount of impressions on the internet, a tech company that sees the second most amount of impressions on the internet outside of Google. There's a little known fact, but it's true.
We're big.
Yeah, so John, you've been looking at this for a while. You have access to a ton of ad inventory. Is the problem any better since the beginning of this year?
I think it certainly is. Well, the challenge still remains. We've seen a reduction in the amount of fraud, just in general, in online advertising. It's certainly better than it was 2 years ago. That's when we really started to invest heavily in systems to identify and remove fraudulent activity. Back then, it was not uncommon to see fraud rates in 30, 40%, 50% or more on some sites. That's become less common now because of all of the attention that the IAB and others in the industry have put on this. I wouldn't necessarily say that OpenX is broadly representative of all online advertising. We don't see every single site. We're selective in who we decide to work with. But we believe through our kind of combination of human processes and automated fraud detection systems, we've been able to really get the amount of fraud on the exchange down to low single digits.
Okay, and Ted, what do you think? How big is the problem industry-wide, not just at OpenX HQ?
It's a good question. These things operate by stealth, so if you can't detect them, you can't count it, and that's one of the big issues. The best numbers that I've seen, the most credible numbers, it runs between $5 and $15 billion a year across search, other sorts of click and impression fraud. So, $15 billion a year, and I computed, you heard it here first, the equivalent of 5,000 average bank robberies per day. Now, what do you think the government would do if somebody were robbing its banks 5,000 times a day?
They may not be so happy with that.
Right. They'd probably, send out the military.
You say that with a smile.
I think that's their response to everything. But anyway.
Right. So, John, that's a pretty significant problem. Let's say it's even half that. It's still 2,500 bank robberies a day. So, what are you at OpenX doing to combat the problem?
Well, we saw that this was a major issue a couple of years ago, and so we've built out an in-house marketplace quality team staffed with experts in statistics, big data, fraud detection, and so forth. And we've built a real-time fraud detection system that looks at literally every single request flowing through our system. And for each one of those requests makes the determination whether we believe that that's robotic traffic or whether there's a real human behind it. And we make that determination by basically putting that traffic through many different tests. So robots tend to have certain tells. And even the more sophisticated ones, if you put them through enough tests, you're likely to have them trip up at least once. And you can use that to determine which traffic then to block from ever entering the exchange and ever being sent out to the buy side, to our demand partners. So we're very proud of this proprietary system that we've built that allows us to do this in real time. And all of that complements all of the rigorous vetting that we do. So we're very selective in which partners, which publishers we work with. We think that's important that in addition to having any real-time systems, any technological solution, there needs to be that human solution as well. The analogy I use is finding a roommate. You know, you could conceivably let anyone become your roommate, invite them into your home, and then have some really sophisticated surveillance equipment, or other monitoring or alarms or what have you, and maybe feel somewhat safe. But probably the first thing you should do, maybe in addition to all of that technology, is just be very selective in who you invite into your house in the first place. So we feel that the exchanges have a role to play in kind of determining who gets to play. Because the bad guys are a creative bunch. They're a very intelligent bunch. They're going to figure out new and novel ways continuously to try to get around fraud detection systems. So by determining or being very selective in who we let in the door in the first place, we keep out the folks who, we're basically keeping them from having that perch on which to conduct their attacks.
And just for, for those in the audience that aren't familiar with OpenX, how about you get 30 seconds to explain what OpenX does?
We help publishers maximize yield from online advertising.
Let's talk about it without,
without the jargon?
Giving the stuff you read on the website. You have no idea what you do. So you have a ad exchange.
We have an ad exchange. We have
programmatic ads are sort of sold out to demand side platforms where
that's right.
Buyers buy the ads. You have an ad server.
That's right.
And a supply side platform where
SSP.
Publishers can monetize their inventory.
Exactly.
Okay, Ted, is what they're doing enough? I mean, I know you're not in there every day, but is what OpenX is doing enough to really combat the problem? And let's say it is, then what about the rest of the industry? Does every single company have to be this proactive in order to beat it?
Yes, and more than just companies. By the way, I think what OpenX is doing is fantastic. It's hard for these guys because, there's a lot of revenue that comes through those pipes, a lot of impressions, and they got to say no to that business, which means they take a hit. And when your board is saying, tell me again why we're being the white knight, and it causes a loss for us, right? So it is really, really good and noble, I think, to the extent that's possible in our industry at all, that they're doing this. And now, what remains is for everyone else to do it. What I think is it's hard for the exchanges, it's hard for media companies, and there's a lot more that different aspects of the industry can do. For example, I called Homeland Security's ICE team about this a few months ago, and they said, okay, Mr. McConnell, we get it. What law is being broken? It might not even be illegal, right? I mean, it is deception for gain, which makes it fraud, but fraud is really hard to prove. Where does the evidence come from, right? So you've got click fraud, you've got, anytime there's money, you're going to find fraud, right? Search is a big place for it. So everybody has to clean up their act, and you're going to need better CAPTCHAs. You're going to need legislation. You might even need to start putting proxy servers on international links to the US the way China does.
So let me ask you this. So you said that in some exchanges or media companies, people have to have a fight that they need to wage in order to get the fraud to be stopped. Do you really think, does that actually happen?
I don't think anyone would say, oh, let's continue to support fraud. I mean, of course not. Everybody wants to do good advertising and do their best for their customers. On the other hand, if you got to go spend a lot of money so that you can turn down certain impressions and not be able to offer those to your customers,
right.
That's hard. And how, you know, are you going to say, well, that's the top of our priority list, since after all, it's going to make ROI go negative, right? I mean, so it's a very, it's just a hard decision to make.
Right, and let's talk about who this benefits. It can benefit an advertiser who's showing good performance on an ad campaign. It can benefit an ad tech company because they get paid on the percentage of spend, even though no real ads are being bought. And it can benefit a publisher. At least, you know, this is all sort of self-serving stuff for them.
That's what I'm saying.
But it can benefit a publisher because they get paid on bot traffic.
Right. And so all the above. Now, it's important to distinguish between bots that have fraudulent intent and bots that simply pump up your traffic, okay? There's tons of robots out there that are basically benign. They're not trying to make money directly by monetizing impressions. They can only do that on their own sites. And so the big MO for bots is they create about 20 or 30,000 websites per day in one of these botnets. And then 24 hours later, they delete all of them and create another 30,000 brand new websites. And then they send their own friends to those bots, to those websites, and those websites send the impressions to the exchanges. That's kind of how it works for impression fraud. But other than those, there's just ambient, there's bots running around trying to figure out what this content is about and how many pages that publisher has and, you know, which ads is that publisher running. Those are all basically robotic traffic that's there for relatively benign reasons. And they pump up the impression counts in publishers as well. So it isn't all just fraud, and bots aren't all bad.
John, how often do you see this stuff pop up? And if I could ask you, what's the nastiest thing that you've ever seen in your career on a fraud level?
Restrain the ad fraud.
Yeah, in terms of how frequently it comes up, it's a constant issue. There's always at least a low level of fraud, really, in even with the best of sites. It might be 1 or 2%, and probably fraud is not the right word to use. It's really robotic traffic for some of the reasons that Ted has alluded to. There's just a lot of positive robotic traffic as well, like search crawlers and so forth.
Yeah, but so the malicious stuff.
The malicious stuff, you know, we see it all of the time. In terms of the most kind of nefarious or pernicious stuff that we see, would probably be some of these attempts at what we call impression laundering. And that's where, in addition to the traffic maybe being robotic, it's being misrepresented as to the source of that traffic. So the traffic will appear to be coming from a legitimate site, but in fact the ad is really being shown within a higher risk site, such as illegal download sites or P2P file sharing networks and so forth. We find that to be, you know, particularly troubling because it can be tougher to spot, since these guys do a good job of kind of covering their tracks.
So who's doing this stuff? I mean, who are the people that are perpetrating this? You know, basically what we were hearing for a while was that it was some folks in Eastern Europe. Then AdAge started, you know, getting a lot deeper in our reporting of it, and we found guys in Florida that were doing it. And we know that there's a bunch of people in Canada that are doing it. So it sounds like it's actually, sure, there's probably people that are not in the US or not in North America that are responsible, but it sounds like it's not limited to that at all. What do you think, Ted?
Well, just because they're in Florida doesn't mean they're not Eastern European, but on the other hand, there's nothing to indict. But the problem is, you don't know. They spoof their IP addresses. You don't know where the traffic's coming from. So the problem is we don't really know. Now, they have to be organized, and it is out and out theft. They're lying about everything. And they're taking money from advertisers, lowering the ROI of the entire digital pool. They're really hurting the industry in a substantial way. so that they can walk away with money that's 5,000 bank robberies per day and not get caught at all, right? So you got to think it's some kind of mob, organized crime, because you got to be organized and it is a crime. And it's so profitable. This stuff makes gambling and prostitution look like bad business, right? I mean, geez, 5,000 banks a day and you get away clean.
So, John, you're on the tech side. Do you see where some of this is coming from? Or do you know the people involved?
It's hard to trace them back to specific folks. I mean, we can see certain areas of the world that certainly cause a disproportionate amount of robotic traffic, but then tying that back to specific individuals is very challenging. And even if we were able to identify those specific individuals or companies, many of them are located offshore and therefore are out of the U.S. jurisdiction, and it can be almost impossible to really go after them.
Right, and even as Ted said, maybe you can't even prosecute them if you find them.
Yeah.
What about the media coverage? How have publications like ours and others that have been focused on this subject done covering it, in your opinion? Why don't you say it? Start, Ted.
I don't read all the media coverage, although I've written a couple articles. It's hard to be neutral, and the media has sort of achieved that point. So I'm kind of more interested in opinion. It seems like it's very risky to cover this because there are so few facts. There really aren't that many good facts. So a lot of good journalists will shy away. The other thing, of course, is you're casting aspersions. If Mike Shields says this company has lots of ad fraud, that company is going to sue him in a big hurry and nobody can prove anything. So the bottom line is the press has its hands tied in a lot of ways to do the kind of reporting that may be required.
Yeah, I mean, I can say, at least from my perspective, because I've done some of that reporting, is that it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. But, you know, I guess the time, when you put the time in, sometimes you can get to the bottom of things. But it is a very hard thing to do, and a lot of folks, I guess, just don't want to.
The best tech people in the world are on both sides of this. They are the bad guys, and they are the crime fighters, okay? Nobody's to the bottom of it. So it's really, really hard for the very best people. So it's going to be hard to report on.
So does this mean, so it's so hard, even to report on it is difficult, does this mean that sort of the advertising industry is stuck with the fraud problem? What do you think? I mean, if we can't even sort of get to if it's that obscure, so, you know, does that mean that nobody's going to be able to really get to the bottom of it? Is it going to be just this inherent evil that's going to exist in the ad industry?
But we've been through this before. So, you know, my background, I was at Yahoo for many years in paid search, and the paid search industry had to go through this as well. It just had a lead of a few years where it was a major issue, but then the big players in the space invested in the technology, in the people to root out the problem and to turn it into a chronic issue, but one that is completely under control. And now it's time for the display space and programmatic to do the same thing. We're at that same sort of inflection point where for the industry to grow, to become a major part of online advertising, such as paid search has, we need to kind of grow up, mature, and get these systems in place.
Yeah, I agree with that. Where, you know, you have to be alert to the danger, and then you can start to deal with it, and we're in that phase. But there are still some things that have to happen. This is special in a lot of ways. It's different than some other kinds of fraud. I think we need some legislation anyway to say that you can't do this. We need to get the industry actually acting with force. I'm afraid that if we don't act fast enough, that advertisers are going to do something like a class action lawsuit. You know, hey, they're taking my money. You're aiding and abetting. Done, okay? You're making money from all this. Therefore, under RICO, you know, you can be sued, right? So I'm worried unless we take stronger action as an industry, the kind that OpenX is taking across the board, that some advertiser is going to really get fed up, and then we'll see what happens, right? So we're doing the right thing. I just think we got to move faster and more aggressively on more fronts.
It's a pretty heavy lift. Okay, why don't we go to some questions from the audience? We got one right up front.
I don't need a mic. If the bad guys make their money by reselling fraudulent clicks, the bad guys make their money by reselling fraudulent clicks, who would buy those clicks? I mean, why would you buy clicks from an unknown source unless you were a bad guy too?
I think you can handle that one.
Well, in some cases, it may just be ignorance. You know, these fraudulent sources of traffic, the botnets and so forth, don't go out and present themselves as botnets or fraudulent sources of traffic. They go to publishers, they knock on the door, and they say, we can offer you extremely cheap traffic. We can offer you, users for half a penny. That sounds great if you're a publisher. I can now expand my audience significantly by working with this new network or this new traffic source. You may not have the sophistication to know that that may be robotic traffic. You may not have the means to determine that yourself. Or you may just turn a blind eye to it because, you don't want to know.
Do they add those clicks that they buy to the normal clicks that they generate on legitimate websites?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you want to repeat the question? So do they add those clicks that they buy to the ones they generate on legitimate websites?
Yeah.
The answer.
I mean, there are some sites out there that are purely fake, and all of their traffic is fake. But the smart guys know that the most compelling solution or the most compelling offering to advertisers will be one where it looks legit. It looks like a legitimate site. It looks like it has legitimate users. So what you'll see is they have a real audience to some extent, but they're supplementing that with traffic that they're purchasing from less than reputable sources.
Yep.
Okay, great. Do we have time for maybe one or two more questions? How about right over here?
Hi. You may have some perspective on this, you may not, but I'm sympathetic to this because I'm dealing with a situation where I'm trying to work through fraud with a publisher. And I'm sort of curious what parallels, if any, you might draw to fraud in the offline industry. One of the concerns I have is that despite fraud, online advertising is still viable in a lot of instances. And you might have some advertisers who say, well, no, because of this fraud, I'm only going to work in traditional mediums. I'm only going to work in print, television, et cetera. And it's difficult for me to believe that those industries haven't had to deal with similar issues because obviously there's incentive there to over-report on impressions. And what, if any, parallels are there between what's being undertaken in the online industry and traditional advertising?
Yeah, I used to know a grocery manager who said, I get it, there's some meat that's going to fall off the truck, but why is it always the fillets? Every industry has some kind of endemic waste. And if you remove yourself from the intention, what this looks like through an ad campaign is just waste. It's really a bot seeing an impression is no different than an impression that's not in view, or one that's off target, or one that's vastly over frequency. So it's just incremental waste. Retailers have a word for their incremental waste. They call it shrinkage. Okay. So yeah, I mean it's those kinds of accumulated petty thefts are endemic to any place where there is something of value. And it just so happens that in our business, it moves at the speed of light and it goes to an invisible place that we can't catch. So we're working on that.
Okay, I think that's going to do it for time on this one, but certainly this is a topic that we're going to continue to follow really closely on our website and our magazine, so stay tuned for some more stories on that. Why don't we get a round of applause for John and Ted?